The wind drew long fingers through the grass, combing the prairie into rippling waves the color of tarnished gold. Dust rose in faint spirals where the dirt road cut its way through the land, and the silence of evening stretched wide, broken only by the creak of the windmill and the occasional lowing of a cow somewhere beyond the fence. She stood on the porch with a pail still damp from the well, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching as shadows thickened across the yard. The house behind her seemed too large for one person, its windows dark, its boards groaning when the wind pressed against them. She lived within those boards as though inside her own ribs, everything tight, contained, and a little hollow. Her days had fallen into a rhythm she both depended on and resented. At dawn she lit the stove, stoked the fire, and stepped into the fields while dew still clung to stalks of grass. She carried feed to hens, milked the cow with practiced motions, and patched what broke before it unraveled further. The work was endless, but the work kept her steady. It had been 2 years since her parents left the earth and left her this piece of it to tend alone, and in that time she had grown accustomed to silence filling the place where conversation used to be. She did not weep much anymore. Instead, she listened to the wind and pretended it was enough. Neighbors existed, though not near. The town lay a ride away, and she went there sparingly. Each trip was marked by eyes that followed too closely, questions too pointed. How was she managing? Why had she not accepted help? Did she not know a woman could not hold land alone without the protection of a husband? She offered polite answers and bought her supplies, then retreated quickly home, where judgment could not breathe down her neck. The fence posts around her property leaned with age, but she stood straighter for their failing, as if to prove she could. That evening, as the horizon burned down to a line of copper and the sky deepened into a bruised violet, she saw movement along the road. A shape, small at first, then larger as it drew near. A man leading a horse, the animal's head bowed low, and across its back the limp figure of a child. She tightened her grip on the porch rail, uncertain if her eyes deceived her. Travelers were not unheard of, but few came this way unbidden. The man's gait was slow but determined. He moved with the kind of weariness that suggested miles behind him and no clear end ahead. When at last he stepped into the yard, dust clinging to his boots and coat, she saw his face shadowed beneath the brim of a hat. His jaw was sharp, unshaven, his eyes downcast, though there was a quiet steadiness in set of shoulders. The boy balanced across the saddle stirred faintly, a thin sound escaping his lips, more sigh than word. The woman's heart quickened. She saw then that the child's leg was wrapped in cloth darkened with blood. The man stopped a respectful distance from the porch, removed his hat, and held it against his chest. His voice, when it came, was low and even, as though shaped by long practice and restraint. "Give us a place to rest," he said. "I'll work your land." The words hung between them, simple yet carrying the weight of desperation. She studied him, uncertain, the last light of the day painting his face in lines of gold and shadow. His eyes lifted briefly to hers, and she saw not pleading but a quiet endurance, as though he had been turned away many times yet could not stop trying. Her gaze shifted to the boy, no older than 9, pale with fever, his hair matted against his forehead. The woman's chest tightened. She remembered her younger brother before illness took him, remembered holding a hand too small and too fragile, remembered the helplessness. The man touched the boy's shoulder with such care it startled her, an instinctive gesture, protective, though the child was not his own blood. She stepped down from the porch, the boards groaning under her weight. The smell of dust and sweat met her, but beneath it lingered something softer, an honesty in the man's silence, a steadiness she could not dismiss. "You're strangers," she said, her voice careful. "Yes, ma'am. You've nowhere else to go?" He shook his head once. "Know where that'll have us." The boy stirred again, whispering something inaudible. She pressed her lips together, torn between caution and compassion. The town would have its say if she harbored them, would whisper sharper than ever. But here, in the wide quiet of her yard, the judgment of others felt small beside the sight of a child half lost to pain. She gestured toward the porch. "Bring him inside," but only for the night. Relief flickered across the man's face. Not open, not overwhelming, but enough to soften the line of his jaw. He lifted the boy gently, as though lifting glass, and carried him through the doorway she held open. The woman led them to the spare room, once her parents', now unused. The bed sagged a little but was clean. She lit a lamp, the glow brushing the boy's pale face, and fetched water to cool his fever. The man lingered near the door, hat in his hands, eyes lowered. He seemed uncertain how close he might stand, as though afraid of overstepping. She noticed the hollows beneath his cheekbones, the way his shirt hung loose as if meals had been scarce. Yet his silence did not press upon her. It left space, as though he carried his burden alone rather than laying it on her shoulders. "What happened to him?" she asked, wringing out the cloth. "Horse threw him. Broke the leg clean. I said it best I could." His voice wavered, then steadied. "We've been walking near 3 days since." She touched the boy's forehead, warm beneath her palm. Her throat tightened again. "He needs rest. And food." The man inclined his head. "We'll earn it." The simplicity of the statement startled her more than elaborate thanks might have. He did not beg, did not flatter. He simply offered what he had, his labor, in exchange for kindness. That honesty stirred something she had long kept buried. As the boys settled into uneasy sleep, she led the man back to the kitchen. The lamp cast long shadows against the walls, the air thick with the smell of stew she had left simmering. She ladled him a bowl without asking, set it before him, and watched him eat with quiet efficiency, every movement careful, almost reverent, as though the food were more grace than necessity. She ate little herself, instead studying him from across the table. He did not fill silence with words. When his eyes met hers, they held a gravity that unsettled and steadied her at once. There was no hunger in his gaze for anything but survival. She felt safer in that realization than she expected. When the bowl was empty, he rose, rinsed it without instruction, and set it back upon the shelf. His hands were calloused, knuckles scarred from work, yet they moved gently. He paused before speaking again. "I don't aim to trouble you longer than you'll allow. Tomorrow I'll mend your fence. Put my back to your soil, if you'll have it." Her lips parted, a reply hovering but unspoken. She wanted to say she did not need him, that she had managed alone and could continue. But the truth pressed in. The land had been wearing her down, and though she bore it with pride, she could not deny the relief she felt at the thought of shared labor. Still, she would not let him see that. "We'll see," she said. He inclined his head once more, then took to the floor beside the boy's bed rather than accepting the offer of the spare cot. She watched in the doorway as he removed his coat, folded it beneath his head, and settled into stillness, his hand resting lightly near the child as if to guard against dreams. The woman returned to her own room, the house strangely changed by the presence of others. The silence she had grown used to was broken, yet not shattered. It was reshaped, carrying a different weight. She lay awake long after the lamp was extinguished, listening to the steady breath of the prairie wind outside and the softer, steadier breath of the child in the next room. Her heart ached with something she could not name. Perhaps it was memory, perhaps warning, perhaps the fragile hope that she was not as alone as she had believed. She did not know what the morning would bring, whether man and boy would remain, whether the town would soon whisper her name sharper than ever. But tonight, the choice had been hers, and for the first time in many seasons, she felt the faint stir of possibility move through her like wind through tall grass, bending what had long stood rigid, asking it to sway. Morning broke with pale light spilling across the floorboards, stretching long fingers into corners of the room. She rose as she always did, before the rooster's crow, her body tuned to the rhythms of labor. Yet the house felt altered. The familiar hush was no longer hers alone. There was a faint murmur of a child's restless sleep, and the heavier silence of the man keeping vigil beside him. She hesitated at her own door, listening, before stepping softly into the hall. The boy stirred, breath uneven, and she found the man already awake, crouched beside the bed, adjusting the bandage at the child's leg. His hat was set neatly on the floor beside him, his hair dark and rumpled from rest. He looked up only briefly, eyes catching hers, then returned to his task. She was struck again by his restraint. How he moved with care, how he did not assume her permission even in the smallest of things. She went about her morning work, though each task felt slightly unfamiliar, with another set of footsteps near. By the time the sun edged above the horizon, the man had joined her in the yard, sleeves rolled, tools in hand. He did not wait for instruction. He examined the sagging fence, tested each post with the weight of his hands, and set to work as though he had always belonged to the land. She watched him from the porch, caught between unease and a reluctant admiration. The rhythm of his labor was steady, unhurried but unyielding. Each strike of the hammer carried an assurance she had not felt in years. The fence that had leaned uncertainly now began to stand straighter, row by row. She caught herself pausing in her chores to glance his way, unsettled by the quiet dignity in his movements. He asked for nothing more than the work, and somehow that unsettled her more than if he had demanded praise. The boy remained in the house, resting, though she carried him broth at noon. He accepted the spoonfuls shyly, his eyes darting toward the door as though to ensure the man was near. When she asked if he was hungry, he whispered yes, and though his voice was thin, there was trust in the way he let her steady the bowl in his small hands. She wondered how long it had been since he had known a home that felt safe. As the days stretched on, the man repaired not only the fence but also a section of roof she had left to weather another season. By evening, sweat darkened his shirt, dust clung to his boots, yet he stood tall, a quiet endurance radiating from him. When she offered supper, he accepted with a nod, his gratitude spoken more in the stillness of his gaze than in words. She tried not to notice the subtle shift within herself, the relief of another presence to shoulder burdens, the unfamiliar warmth of voices, however few, filling the rooms. But the shift grew harder to ignore in the days that followed. The boy's strength returned little by little. He began to sit up, then to smile at her as she passed. One morning, she found him drawing shapes in the dust with a stick, humming softly. The sound startled her, fragile and bright, like a bird returned after winter. She realized then how long it had been since such a sound lived within these walls. The man, too, became a constant in the rhythm of her days. He rose early, worked without complaint, and carried himself with a quiet respect that unsettled the careful solitude she had built. He never crossed a threshold without pause, never spoke more than needed, yet his presence grew larger than silence. She found herself attuned to the sound of his boots in the yard, to the weight of his shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun. It was in town that the shift bore consequence. She went for supplies as always, but now she was not invisible. Eyes followed her sharper than before. Whispers braided themselves between shelves and pews. A young woman living alone was scandal enough. A young woman sheltering a man, and a boy not her kin was fuel for a fire. She held her chin high, but inside she felt the sting of their judgment. At the general store, Mrs. Langley leaned too close. Her voice dipped in false sweetness. "My dear," folk are talking. "A woman ought to think of her reputation. That man, he's a drifter, isn't he? Dangerous to let such as him under your roof." She forced a tight smile, murmured something polite, and carried her sack of flour back to the wagon. Her heart pounded as though she had been accused outright. The words lingered like burrs clinging to her skirt. When she returned home, she found a man splitting wood by the barn, the boy seated nearby with a book someone in town had once discarded. She stood watching, the tension still wound tight within her. He glanced up, caught her gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. He did not ask what troubled her. Instead, he split another log, stacked it neatly, and in that gesture she felt steadied, though she could not say why. That night, she lay awake longer than usual. The town's whispers pressed at her chest, but so too did the memory of the boy's laughter, the sight of the fence standing straight, the warmth of food eaten together by lamplight. She wondered what she valued more, the approval of voices that would never soften, or the fragile, growing peace within her own home. In the weeks that followed, gossip sharpened. A cattleman named Harris, broad-shouldered and loud of voice, made a point of cornering her outside the church. His words cut close, cloaked in concern but edged with threat. "You ought to be careful who you bring under your roof. Folks won't look kindly on it. Best send him on his way before trouble finds you." Her throat tightened, but she offered no reply. Instead, she turned and walked home, every step heavy with the weight of choice pressing near. The man said nothing of it when she returned, though she suspected he knew. He carried himself more carefully, as if to ease a burden he placed upon her. But she wished he would speak, wished he could pierce the quiet that surrounded him. Yet perhaps it was his silence that steadied her most. The way he bore the town's suspicion without flinching, the way he never demanded reassurance she could not give. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she found herself lingering near him as he mended a broken hinge. She asked where he had come from, what had brought him here. He paused, set aside his tools, and after a long silence said only, "A promise I couldn't keep. But I keep him." He nodded toward the boy, and she saw the truth settle in his eyes. A man bound not by blood but by choice, carrying a child through a world too harsh for both. The word struck something deep within her. She had lived bound by expectation, by the quiet weight of her parents' absence and the land they left behind. He lived bound by devotion to a child not his own, shaped by a vow that gave him purpose even in hardship. Their burdens were different, yet somehow the same. As the boy's leg mended and his laughter grew bolder, the house filled with a warmth she had not allowed herself to imagine. Yet outside, the world pressed harder. Harris returned with sharper words. Neighbors spoke louder, and the woman felt the ground beneath her feet tremble between two choices: safety in solitude or risk in connection. The air in town carried the sharpness of approaching storm, though the sky remained stubbornly clear. She felt in the way conversations hushed when she passed, in the glances that lingered too long, in the weight of silence that clung after her footsteps. Harris had grown bolder, his words circling ever closer to threat. She sensed the breaking point drawing near, though she could not yet see its shape. At home, the boy was nearly whole. He limped still, but laughter followed him now, weaving through the house like sunlight. He brought her small treasures from the yard, smooth stones, feathers, wildflowers, and each gift she accepted with a smile she had forgotten she owned. The man remained steady as ever, labor without complaint, his silence a shield against the world's noise. She knew the town judged her, but here in the quiet she felt a life taking root, fragile but true. It was at the market square on a Sunday morning that everything came to its head. The town had gathered, voices blending in the easy hum of trade and gossip. She walked among them with the boy at her side, his small hand tucked trustingly into hers. The man followed a pace behind, carrying a sack of flour, his hat pulled low. The air felt charged, as though every gaze turned upon them, waiting. Harris stepped forward, broad-shouldered and flushed with certainty, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "It's one thing to offer charity, miss, but quite another to shame yourself before decent folk. A woman living with a drifter and a boy that ain't even his? This town won't stand for it." The word struck like a whip, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. Some eyes darted away, unwilling to be caught staring, but others gleamed with a hunger for spectacle. She felt the boy's hand tighten in hers, trembling, his eyes wide with fear. Behind her, the man stood motionless, jaw clenched, his silence heavier than stone. She knew he would not defend himself. He bore insult as he bore hardship, without flinch, without protest. But this was not his battle to fight. It was hers. Her heart thundered as she stepped forward, every eye upon her. She felt the heat rise in her face, the weight of judgment pressing close, but beneath it stirred something steadier than fear. Her voice, when it came, trembled only at first. "This is my land," she said. "My house. My choice. I took them in because I saw a boy who needed rest, and a man who would give his hands to keep him safe. If you call that shame, then it is a shame I'll bear gladly." The square fell into stillness. The boy clung tighter to her, and behind her she sensed the man's gaze, sharp and unblinking, though he spoke no word. Harris sneered, shifting his weight, but the certainty in her voice had unsettled him. He muttered something low, then turned away, his bluster deflated. The crowd murmured again, softer this time, less certain. A few women nodded faintly, as though unwilling to say aloud what they understood in silence. She stood tall, her chest heaving, the echo of her words still hanging in the air. For the first time, she felt the town's judgment loosen its grip. They might continue to whisper, might cast looks, but she had spoken into the heart of their scrutiny and found herself unbroken. When they returned home, the boy skipped beside her despite his limp, his face alight. The man walked in silence, but at the gate he paused. She turned, met his eyes, and in them she saw gratitude deeper than words, steady as the earth beneath their feet. That evening, the prairie lay quiet beneath a sky strewn with stars. She moved through the house with a lightness she had not known in years, setting supper, listening to Boyd chatter about the shapes he saw in the clouds earlier. The man sat at the table, his hands folded, his gaze resting not on the food but on her. When she met it, he did not look away. No declarations passed between them, no promises spoken aloud. Instead, she felt in the small things, the way he reached for the boy's bowl before his own, the way his silence held space rather than distance, the way her own breath steadied in his presence. What bound them was not hunger or urgency, but the quiet strength of having chosen, each in their own way, to stay. After the boy had gone to bed, she stepped outside, the night air cool against her skin. The man followed, standing a little apart, lantern light flickering against his face. For a long moment they said nothing, the silence filled with crickets and the low whisper wind. Then he spoke, his voice low, roughened by restraint. "You didn't have to." She turned toward him, the weight of the day still warm in her chest. "I did." His eyes held hers, searching, steady. No more words came, but none were needed. She felt the truth in the way his hand brushed lightly against hers as they stood side by side, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. To her it was everything, the quiet acknowledgement of a bond neither had sought yet both had found. The prairie stretched wide around them, the house standing firm behind, the boy sleeping safe within. She thought of the whispers that would surely continue, the judgments that would not easily fade. But she also thought of Fenn standing straight, of the boy's laughter, of the man's steady labor and the silence that no longer felt empty. The life ahead would not be simple, but it would be theirs. And as she lifted her face to the stars, she felt something take root within her, a certainty she had long resisted. She was no longer a woman surviving alone, bound by duty and silence. She was a woman who had chosen, who had spoken, who had claimed not just her land but her own heart. The man beside her shifted, his presence warm and solid against the cool night. She did not reach for his hand, nor he for hers, yet the space between them hummed with quiet understanding. In that space lay the promise of tomorrow, not spoken but lived, not demanded but earned. And when she finally turned back toward the house, lantern light spilling ahead, she felt the ground steady beneath her feet, as though the land itself recognized the change. She had given them a place of rest, yes, but in return they had given her something greater, the courage to rest within her own choice, her own voice, her own heart. One night, as the prairie wind howled against the shutters, she stood at the window watching a man walk back from the barn, lantern swinging in his hand. The boy slept soundly in the next room, his breath even. She felt the town's judgment circling like wolves at the edge of the light. But here, within these walls, she felt something stronger than fear. She did not yet know if she had the courage to claim it. But as the lantern's glow drew closer and the sound of steps reached the porch, she felt the stirrings of resolve begin to root within her, faint but growing, like the first green shoot pressing through stubborn soil.